The December cold bit at everything it touched. The kind of cold that made the world feel smaller, tighter, like it was holding its breath. On this particular evening, that cold pressed down on the driveway of the Meridian Palace Hotel, one of the most exclusive venues in the state, the kind of place where a single night's event cost more than most people made in 6 months. Marcus Reynolds pulled his Ford F-150 into the valet line at 6:47 p.m. The truck was 14 years old, dented tailgate, rust spots on the wheel wells that no amount of cleaning could fix. It was honest work in metal form, reliable, dependable, and completely out of place among the Bentleys and Rolls-Royces and a cherry red Ferrari that probably cost more than Marcus's entire garage business would ever generate in a lifetime. Sophia Reynolds sat in the passenger seat, her small frame wrapped in a navy blue dress. She'd picked it out herself from the clearance rack at Kohl's. She chose it specifically because it had sparkles, the same kind of sparkles her mother used to wear. Years ago, back when Eleanor was still alive. And the world hadn't yet learned how to break without warning. The dress wasn't expensive, it wasn't designer or tailored or anything that would belong in this place. But Sophia had loved it the moment she saw it. And Marcus had loved it the moment he saw her love it. In her lap, she clutched something far more precious than any designer gown could ever be. A handmade card, construction paper, glitter glue, a heart drawn in purple marker with childish precision. Inside, in shaky block letters that took her 2 hours to write, she had written, "For Mama's children, love Sophia." Marcus looked down at his daughter. He tried to will himself into a sense of calm he didn't entirely feel. 8 years old, smart beyond measure, perceptive in the way that only children of loss could be. She'd been born 2 years after Eleanor, so she barely remembered her mother. What she knew came from stories Marcus told, and from the photograph that hung in her bedroom. Eleanor holding her as a newborn, both of them looking towards something beyond the camera's reach. "Daddy," Sophia said quietly. She pressed her small nose against the window. "Are all those cars real?" Marcus smiled, though something tight moved through his chest. "They're real, baby girl." "Why don't ours look like that?" He didn't answer right away. His hands were still damp. He'd washed them in the truck's tiny sink. He'd spent the afternoon under a 2008 Chevy Silverado, working on Mr. Thompson's truck. Mr. Thompson was a retired Marine, on a fixed income. He needed his truck running by Monday. He couldn't afford the going rate. So Marcus had charged him $50 for 3 hours of skilled labor. That was who Marcus was. That was what Eleanor had believed in. Work meant something. Taking care of people meant something. The grease still wouldn't come completely off his hands, no matter how hard he scrubbed. "Because ours works hard," Marcus finally said. "Just like your daddy works hard." He paused. Sometimes the things that work hardest don't look the prettiest. He looked at her carefully, but they're worth more. Sophia frowned, still not satisfied with this answer. The way children weren't satisfied when they sensed an adult was simplifying something complex. Marcus pulled the truck further up in the valet line. His suit, the one he'd worn to his own wedding 11 years ago, suddenly felt very thin. The lining was cheap. The sleeves were slightly too short. There was an oil stain on the cuff. He tried and failed to remove it that morning. He tied his tie loosely, and Sophia had insisted on tightening it for him, which meant it was now slightly crooked, held together by a child's interpretation of how these things worked. "Look at me for a second, Em," he said. He used the nickname that was hers alone. Sophia turned from the window. Marcus crouched down as much as he could in the truck's cab, so their eyes were level. "That card you made," he said, speaking quietly with a kind of intensity that made his daughter understand this was important. "That card is the most important thing in this whole building tonight." He paused. "Let that sink in. Do you understand me? More important than all the fancy dresses. More important than all the fancy food. More important than every diamond on every finger in that room. Sophia's eyes widened. Why, Daddy? Because it came from your heart that loves. He touched her chest gently. And your mama, she built everything tonight on love, not money. He paused. Love. So you walk in there with your head held high. Because your last name means something in that building, whether these people know it tonight or not. Eleanor Reynolds built something beautiful. And you're her daughter. That means something. Sophia nodded. Her small puffball ponytails bounced as she did. Marcus stood up. He straightened his crooked tie. Sophia's careful knot had held, and he took her hand. They walked together toward the gold revolving doors of the Meridian Palace. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature changed. Not the actual temperature of the air, but something else, something that happened in the space between them and everyone else. The difference between existing and being noticed. The difference between walking through a room and being made visible by judgment. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth. A 40-foot Christmas tree glittered in the center of the rotunda, decorated with ornaments that each cost more than Marcus's week's worth of groceries. A string quartet played somewhere in the distance, the kind of music that costs thousands of dollars to arrange for a single evening. Women in floor-length gowns clinked champagne flutes with men in tuxedos that had been tailored in Milan. The air smelled like expensive perfume. Cedar. Money. The kind of money that had generational weight to it. The kind that didn't need to prove anything. Because it had already been proven for decades. And every single head turned when Marcus and Sophia walked in. Not all at once. It happened in waves. A woman in a silver dress whispered behind her hand to her husband. A man with a grey mustache lowered his glass. He stared openly at Marcus's suit, taking in the cheap lining, the short sleeves, the faint oil stain on the cuff. His eyes traveled upward. A slow, deliberate assessment. That left Marcus feeling distinctly weighed and found wanting. Sophia shrunk against her father's leg. She was brave. Incredibly brave for an 8-year-old, but she was also perceptive. She could feel the shift in the room's energy, the way some people could feel a change in barometric pressure before a storm. "Daddy," she whispered, "they're looking at us." Marcus placed his hand on her small shoulder. His voice was calm, steady. The voice of someone who had learned long ago that showing fear only gave others permission to hunt. "Let them look, baby. Let them look." They walked toward the welcome table, where a young hostess sat with a tablet. Her job was to verify that guests belonged in this space. She looked up with a practiced smile, bright and welcoming, designed to make people feel seen. Then she actually saw them, and the smile shifted into something more uncertain. "Good evening," the hostess said, her tone now carrying a note of cautious curiosity. "Welcome to the Eleanor Reynolds Children's Foundation Gala. May I have your name, please?" "Marcus Reynolds," he said, +1. The hostess began scrolling through her tablet. Her eyebrows pulled together. She scrolled again. She tapped the screen. "I'm sorry, sir. I'm not finding that name. Could it be under someone else's reservation?" "Try again," Marcus said, not unkindly. "Reynolds. Reynolds. Marcus Reynolds." The hostess's fingers flew across the screen. Her confusion deepened. "Sir, I'm looking and I really don't see." That was when a sharp voice cut through the air like a blade. "Is there a problem here, Megan?" Marcus turned. The woman who had spoken was tall, easily 6 feet. Platinum blonde hair pulled into a bun so severe that it seemed to lift her eyebrows toward the ceiling. She was in her late 40s, though she'd clearly spent considerable money fighting the evidence of those years. She wore a midnight blue gown. That probably cost $15,000. The kind of dress, though, wasn't just bought, but acquired. The kind that required an appointment and a particular kind of checkbook. Diamond drops hung from her ears. catching the light in ways that demanded attention. Her name tag read Victoria Sterling, CEO, Philanthropic Division. Victoria's eyes swept over Marcus, from his scuffed dress shoes to his crooked tie, then dropped to Sophia, taking in the clearance rack dress, the white ribbons, most importantly the little fist clutching a crumpled piece of construction paper, as though it were made of gold. And something happened in Victoria's face. It was a small movement, barely visible, but Marcus saw it because he'd learned long ago to read the micro-expressions, the expressions of people who had just decided he didn't belong. Her upper lip curled, just fractionally, just enough to communicate what she was thinking, without actually saying it out loud. This is not who we invited. Good evening, she said, and her voice had shifted into a different register. Not warm, not cold, but professionally cordial. I'm Victoria Sterling, CEO of the Eleanor Reynolds Foundation. We seem to have a little mix-up. No mix-up, Marcus said quietly. I have an invitation. Victoria's smile never wavered, but it became noticeably thinner. Well, I run the foundation, sir. I would certainly know if we'd invited you. So perhaps you have me confused with another venue? There are several gala events this evening in the downtown corridor. You might have the address. Eleanor Reynolds, Marcus said simply. That's who I was invited by. The shift in Victoria's expression was immediate. Something flickered across her face. A recognition of something. A moment where her certainty wavered. She knew that name. It meant something to her. But not in the way it should have. Eleanor Reynolds passed away, Victoria said. Her voice had become softer now, more controlled, the tone people used when delivering sad news to the families of the deceased. 3 years ago, she was the founder of this foundation, a lovely woman, a tragic loss. But she doesn't send out invitations anymore. Marcus met her eyes and held them. This was the moment. This was where he could back down, where he could apologize, where he could accept the verdict of a woman who'd already decided his worth, based on the cut of his suit. He didn't. I'm not asking for an invitation, Marcus said. I was invited by the foundation itself. My daughter needs to deliver something tonight. Victoria's expression hardened. She stepped in front of the hostess, placing her body between Marcus and the table in a gesture that was meant to be clear. This conversation had moved from unclear to resolved. Sir, she said, and her voice dropped into the register she saved for people she wanted gone. This is a private black tie event. Tickets are $2,500 a plate. If you're here to ask for donations, there's a form on our website. You're welcome to fill it out tomorrow. Marcus kept his voice soft. He'd learned that softness could be a kind of power. I'm not here to ask for anything, ma'am. I was invited. By whom? The question was a challenge now, not a genuine inquiry. The foundation. Victoria's laugh was not warm. It was the kind of laugh rich people perfected, the ability to laugh at someone, while maintaining complete politeness. Sir, I run the foundation. I would know if you were invited. Then you'd know who Eleanor Reynolds was. There. That flicker again. That moment where something registered that shouldn't have. But Victoria was practiced at moving past moments like that. She was practiced at dismissing uncertainty. She lowered her voice to a whisper. The kind of cruel whisper that only the privileged truly mastered. The kind that used quiet as a weapon. Now I'm going to ask you nicely one time. You need to leave. You and your daughter. You're embarrassing yourself. And frankly, you're embarrassing her. She said her like it was a diagnosis. Something very old and very hot rose up in Marcus's chest. It was the heat he'd felt when the loan officer turned him down 3 times, before finally approving the garage loan. It was the heat he'd felt when a customer once handed him the keys to a car and said, "Don't scratch it, I don't trust you people with nice things." It was the accumulated heat of 42 years of being looked at, measured, and found wanting, before anyone had even bothered to ask his name. But he didn't let it show. Instead, he crouched down to Sophia's level, and he whispered something into her ear, something that only she could hear. When he straightened, his face was calm. His voice was steady. "I'm going to go find the board," he said. "They'll be able to clarify who belongs here." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even really said with anger. It was stated as a simple fact, the way someone might say it was going to rain. He took Sophia's hand, and they turned toward the ballroom. Behind them, Victoria realized something. Too late. She'd made a mistake. She'd pushed someone who hadn't flinched. She'd dismissed someone who clearly knew something she didn't, and worse, she'd made a child cry. As Marcus and Sophia walked away from the welcome table, the lobby seemed to part for them in a way it hadn't before. It was subtle, but it was real. People stepped back. Conversations paused. The hostess watched with growing horror. She realized what she'd almost been part of. Victoria stood frozen at the welcome table, her certainty beginning to crack at the edges. Sophia's hand was still small in Marcus's, but her grip had tightened. She was scared, which broke something in Marcus's chest. This was a child who'd already lost her mother. This was a child who'd been taught that the world could be beautiful, and also brutal, often at the same time. And now she was being taught that beautiful spaces could contain people who were cruel. "It's okay, baby," Marcus whispered as they walked. "You did exactly right. Your mama is proud of you." It was something he said often, that Eleanor was proud of her. It was something he believed, with the whole of his being, even though Eleanor existed now only in memory and legacy, and in the small ways that Sophia inherited her mother's kindness. The ballroom was another cathedral, but this one was alive, with music and movement, and the controlled chaos of a wealthy crowd, doing what wealthy crowds did, celebrating themselves, while pretending to celebrate charity. A live band played jazz standards, servers circulated with champagne and canapes. The walls were decorated with photographs of children. The Eleanor Reynolds Foundation's beneficiaries, the real children, the hungry children, the children who would eat because Eleanor had decided they deserved to. Victoria remained at the welcome table, watching Marcus and Sophia disappear into the ballroom. She pulled out her phone. She checked the guest list one more time, scrolling through the names on her tablet. Reynolds, the name that didn't appear anywhere. And then through the open doors of the ballroom, she heard something that made her stomach drop. The sound of multiple board members standing up in greeting. The sound of Robert Chen, the board treasurer, saying in a voice loud enough to carry, "Mr. Reynolds, we weren't sure if you'd attend this evening." The ballroom of the Meridian Palace had been designed to impress, and it succeeded completely. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, like frozen waterfalls of light. The floor was polished to a mirror shine. Flower arrangements cost more than most people's monthly rent. And the people were the real decoration, the very wealthy, the very connected, the very certain of their place in the world. Marcus and Sophia entered into a sudden pocket of silence that rippled outward like water hitting a stone. The first to notice was Robert Chen, a quiet man in his 60s who served as the foundation's treasurer. He'd never met Marcus in person. Everything they'd handled over the past 3 years had been through careful intermediaries and anonymous donations. But he knew the voice, he knew the commitment, and he knew somehow that this was the man, the one who'd been keeping Eleanor's vision alive, while Victoria tried to dismantle it piece by piece. Robert stood immediately. His movement triggered a cascade of other board members standing, people who recognized Marcus, people who had worked with him in secret, people who'd been waiting for this moment, even if they hadn't consciously known they were waiting. "Mr. Reynolds!" Robert said, walking toward him with his hand extended. "We weren't sure if you'd attend this evening. It's an honor to have you here." Victoria appeared in the ballroom doorway at that exact moment. She saw Robert greeting Marcus. She saw the board members standing. She saw the shift in the room's entire energy. The way that Sophia, who had shrunk against Marcus just moments before, was now being recognized and welcomed. And she understood. Not all at once. Understanding came in pieces, like watching dominoes fall. This man wasn't a beggar trying to crash an event. This man was important. This man was part of the Foundation's inner circle, the part she'd never fully been able to access, the part that had quietly opposed her cost-cutting measures and profit maximization strategies. This man knew Eleanor Reynolds. The question was how. Marcus shook Robert's hand firmly. His manner was quiet, humble, the kind of humility that couldn't be faked. "I wasn't going to come," Marcus said, "but Sophia wanted to be here. She has something she wants to contribute tonight." Robert looked down at Sophia, at the handmade card in her small hands. Something shifted in his expression, a kind of tenderness that only people who understood Eleanor's work could access. "A gift," he said softly, "for the Foundation." "For Mama," Sophia corrected him quietly. The room had fallen mostly silent now, everyone understanding in that indefinable way. Something important was happening. Over the next hour, Marcus was introduced to board members, major donors, and Foundation staff. He moved through the space with a quiet grace. That seemed to confuse people. He wasn't dressed like them, didn't speak like them, didn't carry himself with the kind of entitlement that usually came with real power. But he was treated with deference, with respect, with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for royalty or major philanthropists, and all the while Victoria watched. She watched as Marcus was shown to a table at the very front of the room, the guest of honor section, reserved for the Foundation's most important supporters. She watched as Sophia was invited to place her handmade card, the card Victoria had treated like garbage only an hour before, on the Foundation's memorial wall. She watched as people came up to Marcus and spoke to him in hushed, respectful tones. Richard Sterling, her husband, appeared at her side as she stood watching from across the room. "What's wrong?" he asked, his tone carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been married to Victoria for 22 years and had learned to recognize the signs of her anger. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Victoria didn't answer. Her mind was racing, trying to fit the pieces together. The man who'd claimed to be invited by Eleanor Reynolds, the man whose name wasn't on the list, the man whose hands had oil stains under the fingernails, despite his attempt to hide them. What had Richard once told her? Something about a man who'd started a garage in the city's east side, a man who'd gone to school with Eleanor in high school, a man who'd Eleanor. Victoria's stomach turned to ice. "Who is that man?" she whispered to Richard. "The one at the front table." Richard followed her gaze, his jaw tightened. "You don't know who that is." "I asked you a question." Richard took a long breath, the kind of breath someone took before delivering news they knew would be unwelcome. "That's Marcus Reynolds, Eleanor Reynolds' husband." The world didn't spin. That would have been dramatic. Instead, it went very still, very quiet, like the moment before a thunderstorm hits, when everything is holding its breath. Eleanor Reynolds had been dead for 3 years. Eleanor Reynolds, the founder of the Foundation, the woman Victoria had never met, because Eleanor died the year before Victoria was hired. Eleanor Reynolds, whose legacy Victoria had been systematically eroding through cost-cutting measures and profit maximization strategies that Eleanor would have found abhorrent. Eleanor Reynolds, whose daughter was somewhere in this ballroom, with a handmade card. Eleanor Reynolds, whose husband, the man Victoria had called a beggar, whose daughter she had pushed, whose humiliation she had orchestrated, stood at the front of this room, recognized and respected by every person who actually understood what this foundation was supposed to be. Victoria excused herself and walked to the bathroom. She locked herself in a stall and sat on the toilet seat, her hands shaking. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She didn't know it yet. She couldn't possibly comprehend the full scope of what she'd just done. But somewhere in her body, in the place where instinct lived, she knew. She knew. The months that followed the gala were months of careful watching and careful planning. Marcus returned to his life, which was smaller than most people would have expected for someone with his connections, but larger than anyone would have guessed. Based on his exterior, his garage sat on the east side, in a neighborhood that had seen better decades. It was called Reynolds and Company Auto Repair. Though it was just Reynolds, just Marcus, and had been since Eleanor died. And he decided that raising a daughter alone meant he needed work he could control, time he could stretch, and customers he could trust. The garage was meticulously organized. Tools hung on pegboards, each one in its place. The floor was concrete, swept clean daily. Photos hung on the walls. Eleanor on their wedding day. Eleanor holding Sophia as a newborn. Eleanor at a foundation event looking radiant. And next to those, a recent photo of Sophia at school. Her hair in careful braids Marcus had spent 20 minutes perfecting. Her smile gap-toothed and genuine. Customers came to Marcus for honesty. They came because his rates were fair. They came because he didn't try to convince them to repair things that didn't need repairing. They came because when Mr. Thompson, a retired Marine on a fixed income, needed his transmission repaired, Marcus charged him $50 for 3 hours of specialized work, instead of the $800 he could have charged. "That's not good business," Robert Chen had once told him, reviewing Marcus's finances. "That's exactly good business," Marcus had replied. "It's just measured in something other than profit." 6 months after the gala, Richard Sterling walked into the garage with a 1968 Cadillac DeVille that had belonged to his late father. The car was beautiful in the way that old cars could be, all curves and chrome and dignity, but the engine was failing, the transmission was shot, the interior was deteriorating. Richard had brought it to Marcus because after the gala incident, he'd done his research. He'd learned about the quiet mechanic on the east side, who'd once been married to Eleanor Reynolds. He'd learned about the man who kept that foundation alive through anonymous donations when its official leadership was trying to destroy it, and he'd decided it was time to talk to Marcus directly. "I need this restored," Richard said, standing in the garage, "and I'm willing to pay whatever it costs." Marcus looked at the Cadillac, at the craftsmanship of an era that no longer existed. "That'll take time," he said, "and it'll be expensive. Why bring it to me?" Richard met Marcus's eyes. "Because you're honest, and because I think it's time we had a conversation about what Victoria is doing to your wife's foundation." Over the next 8 months, as the Cadillac was restored piece by piece, new transmission, new engine, interior carefully rebuilt, Richard told Marcus everything. He told him about Victoria's plans to cut the hot meals program that fed 3,000 children every day. He told him about the profit maximization strategies that prioritize donor events over actual charity work. He told him about the foundation's funds being funneled into Victoria's friends' companies at inflated prices. He told him about the executive bonuses that had grown while the program budgets had shrunk. Marcus listened. He didn't rage. He didn't immediately declare what he would do. He simply listened and let the information settle into the space where his grief lived, the space where his determination to honor Eleanor lived. "What do you want to do?" Richard finally asked. One afternoon, as Marcus worked on the Cadillac's interior, Marcus didn't answer immediately. He continued working, his hands steady, his movements precise. "I'm going to save the foundation," he finally said. "Eleanor wouldn't want me to destroy Victoria, but she would want me to stop her. Those are different things." 3 weeks later, Marcus made an offer on the Meridian Palace Hotel. It happened quietly, through intermediaries, through corporate shells that had no connection to Marcus Reynolds. The current owner was retiring and eager to sell. The price was negotiable, and Marcus had something most people didn't. He had resources, hidden resources, resources accumulated quietly through careful investments, through the mechanics business that was far more successful than it appeared, through choices Eleanor had made years ago about what their money should do and how it should grow. The purchase took 6 months to finalize. On the day it was officially complete, Marcus received a deed of ownership in his name, full majority ownership of the Meridian Palace Hotel, the venue of the Eleanor Reynolds Foundation Gala, the place where Victoria celebrated her power. Victoria never found out. The building ran the same way. The staff didn't change. The restaurant continued to function. The gala was already booked for the next year. Everything appeared stable and unchanged. The only difference was who collected the profits. Marcus held this knowledge quietly, not like a weapon waiting to be used, but like a seed waiting to grow. 18 months after the gala, Victoria called an emergency board meeting. She was in an excellent mood, which was something everyone noticed. She'd spent the morning reviewing the foundation's latest financial statements, and the numbers from her perspective were perfect. The Hot Meals program was gone, consolidated into a smaller, cheaper initiative. The after-school programs that required actual supervision and resources had been eliminated. The community outreach staff had been cut by 40%, and the savings had been tremendous in a way that would look very good in her end-of-year bonus calculation. The board meeting happened on a Thursday afternoon, in a conference room on the 7th floor of an office building downtown. 12 board members sat around a polished table. Victoria sat at the head of it, confident, in control. "I've called this meeting to inform you of an exciting development," she began, sliding documents across the table. "We've received an acquisition offer from Horizon Capital Partners. They're a private equity firm specializing in non-profit optimization. They've offered to purchase the Eleanor Reynolds Foundation's operational assets for $30 million. The board members began scanning the documents, their expressions shifting from curiosity to concern. "What does operational assets mean?" asked Margaret Liu, an elderly board member who'd known Eleanor personally. "Are we selling the foundation?" "We're merging with a larger organization," Victoria said, using words she'd clearly practiced. "That can scale our impact. They'll invest in new technology, new marketing, new approaches to efficiency. This is actually what Eleanor would have wanted: growth-scale modernization." Richard, sitting 3 seats down from Victoria, closed his eyes. He'd known this was coming. He'd tried to warn Marcus, but Marcus had simply smiled that quiet smile of his and said, "Let her make her move." "I move to vote on the acquisition," Victoria said. "All in favor." Richard raised his hand immediately. "I move to postpone this vote. I don't believe we've done sufficient due diligence. This needs more time." "This has been in development for months," Victoria snapped. "I move to vote." The board members looked at each other. Some raised their hands in favor. Some abstained. Victoria counted the votes carefully. 8 in favor, 3 opposed, 1 abstention. She had the majority. "The motion passes," she announced. "The acquisition will move forward. We're signing the preliminary agreements tomorrow morning." Margaret Liu spoke up quietly. "Victoria, can I ask you a direct question?" "Of course," Victoria said, her tone suggesting she found this kind of questioning beneath her. Where did the money from the foundation's budget go? The money that was supposed to go to the hot meals program. Victoria's smile never wavered. Operational efficiency measures, staff reductions, technology investments, administrative streamlining. The hot meals program fed 3,000 children every day, Margaret said. Those children now don't eat hot meals. Where's the efficiency in that? We're focusing on scale, Victoria said coldly. That requires difficult choices. But even as she said it, she was thinking about something else. She was thinking about a man standing in her garage 8 months ago, hands covered in grease and motor oil, looking at her with a kind of pity. That was somehow worse than anger. That night, Victoria sat in her home office and pulled up the foundation's organizational documents. She scrolled through the shareholders, the board members, the ownership structure. Everything appeared straightforward. The foundation was incorporated as a non-profit. Victoria, as CEO, had operational control. The board voted on major decisions. There should have been nothing she'd missed. But there was something in the back of her mind that whispered, "You made a mistake at that gala." 9 months after the board meeting, Victoria's car broke down. It was a flat tire, actually, not an engine failure, but she didn't know that. She knew her car had made a strange sound. And then it had limped to the side of the highway, and now she was standing on the shoulder, in a $700 dress, calling for roadside assistance. The tow truck driver asked her where she wanted to be taken, and without really thinking about it, or perhaps because her subconscious had been dwelling on this for months, she gave him the address, Reynolds and Company Auto Repair. The garage looked the same as it had the day she'd driven past it once months ago, when she was driving to a meeting. And curiosity had compelled her to find this place. It was modest, it was clean. It wasn't impressive by any standard Victoria had learned to measure importance by. But it was clearly, undeniably, honest. She stepped out of the tow truck and walked into the garage. The smell hit her first, grease and oil and metal, and something else that might have been coffee. A young mechanic, probably 22 or 23, looked up from the workbench. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I need my car repaired," Victoria said, her tone suggesting this should be self-evident. "Immediately, if possible." "I have an appointment." The young mechanic's name was James, and he had the kind of patience that comes from working for someone who modeled patience daily. "I'll get Marcus," he said. "He's in the back." The moment Marcus slid out from under the car, his hands already covered in grease, his movements economical and precise, Victoria felt something shift in her chest. It was recognition, yes, but not just of him. It was recognition of all the things she'd misunderstood about him, all the things she'd dismissed, because they didn't fit into her framework for measuring value. Marcus stood up slowly. He wiped his hands on a shop rag, a gesture that was both deliberate and unrushed. And when he looked at Victoria, she saw herself through his eyes. A woman out of place, a woman playing dress-up in a life that wasn't actually hers, a woman pretending to have authority that was already crumbling beneath her feet. "Ms. Sterling says," he said, his voice exactly the same as it had been that night at the gala, calm, measured, betraying nothing. Victoria started, then stopped. She'd planned this conversation in her head. The apology, the explanation, the request for understanding. But faced with the reality of him, all those carefully constructed sentences evaporated. "My car!" The tow truck said. "Flat tire," Marcus said. Walking past her to look at the vehicle, he examined it for 10 seconds. Actually looks like 2 flat tires. And there's a misalignment in the suspension. You were probably pushing the car harder than you should have. The implication was clear. You were in a hurry, probably thinking about something that made you careless. "Can you fix it?" Victoria asked. "Yes," Marcus said. "It'll take a few hours." "You want to wait or come back?" Victoria wanted to say something, an apology, an explanation. a bridge back to some kind of understanding, but Marcus had already turned away and was signaling for James to help him pull the car into the service bay. "I'll wait," Victoria heard herself say. She spent the next 3 hours sitting in the small waiting room of the garage, surrounded by dog-eared magazines and a coffee maker that had clearly been here since the early 2000s. She could see Marcus working through the window, working on someone else's car first, taking his time, explaining things to James, doing the work the way it should be done. When Marcus finally came to tell her the car was ready, something in his expression had changed. Not warmed exactly, but something. He was looking at her, as though trying to see something in her that might be worth seeing. "I'm sorry," Victoria said, standing up. The words came out before she could measure them, before she could contain them in a more manageable form. "For how I treated you at the gala. For what I said about your daughter. I didn't understand." "You didn't ask," Marcus said simply. "You didn't look close enough to see the person. You only saw the suit. And you made a decision about my worth based on that. That's who you are, Ms. Sterling. That's what you've built your entire life on. Decisions made without understanding. Judgments made without inquiry." "I know," Victoria whispered, "and I'm sorry." "Apologies don't change anything," Marcus said, not unkindly, but with a certain finality. "Not yet. First you need to understand what you did, and I'm not sure you're capable of that." He turned and walked back into the garage. Victoria paid the bill. It was fair and reasonable, though more than she'd expected, and drove away. In a car that was now fixed, in a life that was no longer. That night, Victoria went home and pulled up detailed financial records of the foundation. She began tracing money, tracing patterns, looking for the inconsistencies that she'd been too confident to notice before, and slowly, piece by piece, she began to understand that she'd been making mistakes, bigger ones than she'd realized, mistakes that were catching up to her. The email arrived on a Tuesday morning. From the board secretary to all board members, emergency meeting scheduled for Thursday, 9 a.m. Victoria received it with the confidence of someone who still believed she controlled the board. She'd already signed preliminary agreements with Horizon Capital. The acquisition was essentially done. The emergency meeting was likely just a formality, probably triggered by Margaret Liu's concerns that would be resolved in an hour. And then Victoria could return to her office and begin planning the next phase of her career. What she didn't know was that Marcus had been quietly contacting board members all week, not threatening them, not demanding anything, simply asking them a series of questions. What had they known about the foundation when they joined the board? What had Eleanor told them it should be? What did they see happening to it now? And one by one, the board members, the honest ones at least, had begun to understand that they'd been complicit. They had allowed Victoria to reshape the foundation. Without asking enough questions, they had allowed their fiduciary duty to slide. Because Victoria was confident and well-spoken, and they didn't want to seem unsophisticated. Richard Sterling had spoken to Marcus extensively over the past week. He'd shared documents, offered details, laid out everything he'd witnessed. By Thursday morning, Richard had made a decision. His marriage was over. He couldn't stay in a relationship with someone who could look at hungry children and see inefficiency instead of need. He'd consult with a lawyer after the board meeting. Thursday morning arrived cold and clear. The same conference room, the same polished table, the same 12 board members settling into their seats. Victoria arrived 10 minutes late, which was her habit, a power play, a way of suggesting that her time was more valuable than everyone else's. She took her seat at the head of the table and smiled. "Thank you for coming," she began. "I assume you've all reviewed the acquisition documents. I have good news. Horizon Capital has accelerated the timeline. We can sign the final agreement this afternoon if the board votes to proceed." The board members glanced at each other. Margaret Liu spoke up. Victoria, before we vote, I think we need to address some questions that have come up about the foundation's financials. Victoria's smile tightened. The financials are audited. They're clean. The audits don't tell the full story, Margaret said. They tell us where the money went, but not why it went there. And some of the choices you've made seem designed to benefit you personally, rather than the foundation's mission. That's a serious accusation, Victoria said coldly. It's not an accusation, Margaret replied. It's an observation. The hot meals program that served 3,000 children has been eliminated. Why? Operational efficiency, Victoria said. The words wrote now. Meaningless. What about the consulting contracts awarded to your brother's company? Margaret continued. $10 million in contracts for work that could have been done in-house. For 1/10 of the cost. Victoria's jaw tightened. Those contracts were approved by the full board. With full disclosure of your relationship to the contractor, Robert Chen asked quietly. The room had fallen silent. Victoria could feel control slipping. She could feel the certainty that had carried her through the previous months, beginning to fracture. I think we should adjourn, Victoria said, standing up, and reconvene after I've had a chance to address these concerns with counsel. That was when the conference room door opened. Marcus Reynolds walked in with a leather briefcase. He wasn't dressed as he had been at the gala. He was wearing a suit now, a good suit, well-tailored, expensive, and he moved with a kind of quiet authority that made everyone look up. Sophia was not with him. This wasn't something for her to witness. This was the adult business of consequences and accountability. But she was the reason it was happening. Marcus Reynolds, Victoria whispered, the color draining from her face. Sit down, Marcus said simply, directing the instruction at Victoria, with a calmness that was somehow more authoritative than yelling could ever be. Victoria sat. Marcus opened the briefcase and began distributing documents to the board members. Purchase agreements for the Meridian Palace Hotel. Proof of ownership transfer. Financial records showing the complete acquisition of the property 3 months earlier. A corporate document with Marcus's name as majority owner. The hotel where your foundation holds its gala, Marcus said, addressing the board but looking at Victoria. The hotel you work in. The hotel you've held your important meetings in. For the past 2 years. I own it. He continued with more documents. Detailed financial records of Victoria's personal spending. Evidence of contract steering. Proof of misappropriated funds. A comprehensive audit. An independent one. Not the one the foundation used. That showed exactly where money that was supposed to feed children had gone instead. I have also prepared a comprehensive list of Victoria's decisions, Marcus said. He was speaking to the board now. His tone matter-of-fact, his evidence overwhelming. That directly contradicts the foundation's original charter. The foundation was designed to serve the most vulnerable children in our community. Victoria has systematically reduced services to those children, while increasing administrative costs and executive compensation. These aren't operational decisions. These are ethical failures. Victoria tried to speak, but no words came. I don't want to own this foundation, Marcus continued. My wife built it. I'm going to restore it to what she intended it to be. But first we need to remove the obstacles to that restoration. Victoria Sterling is no longer the CEO of the Eleanor Reynolds Foundation. She is terminated effective immediately. He turned to address Victoria directly. Security will escort you from the building. Your access to foundation property is revoked. An investigation into financial misconduct will be referred to federal authorities. You'll be hearing from their offices by end of business tomorrow. Victoria's face had gone absolutely white. You can't do this, she whispered. You don't have the authority. I have every authority, Marcus said, because I own the building. I control the board majority through shares I've quietly accumulated. And I have evidence of criminal misconduct. Yes, I can do this. Security came. They were gentle about it, but they were firm. Victoria was escorted from the conference room, down the elevator, through the lobby, and out into the afternoon light, where she stood disoriented and broken, understanding finally the magnitude of what she'd done. The meeting lasted another 3 hours, but those 3 hours were nothing like the previous moments. They were calm, they were productive, they were about restoration rather than destruction. Marcus presented his plan for the foundation's future. The Hot Meals program would be expanded to serve 5,000 children daily. The after-school programs would be reinstated and expanded. The community outreach staff would be rehired, and new positions would be created. The foundation's focus would return to Eleanor's original vision, not profit, but purpose, not efficiency, but love. I'm not here to run this foundation, Marcus said, addressing the board. I'm here to ensure it's run the way Eleanor intended. I'm going to recommend new leadership. People who understand that a mission isn't a business. It's a calling. Robert Chen raised his hand. What about you, Marcus? Would you consider staying on the board? Marcus hesitated. I'll stay until we found the right person to lead it. Then I'm going back to my garage. That's where I belong. Your wife would be proud, Margaret Liu said quietly. Marcus nodded. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. As the meeting concluded and board members filed out, shaking Marcus's hand, thanking him, expressing relief and gratitude, Marcus felt something shift inside him. Not triumph. He wasn't the type for triumph, but something like peace. The work wasn't done. It would never be done. But the foundation would survive. Eleanor's legacy would continue, and that was enough. That evening, Marcus drove to Sophia's school to pick her up. She was waiting by the front gate, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her eyes bright with questions. How did it go, Daddy? She asked as she climbed into the truck. Marcus pulled away from the school and drove toward home, choosing his words carefully. The foundation is going to be okay, he finally said. Your mama's work is going to be protected. Are you happy? Sophia asked. Marcus considered this. Was he happy? Happy seemed too simple a word for what he felt. Satisfied, maybe. Purposeful, in alignment with who he was supposed to be. I'm at peace, he said finally. That's better than happy. That night he helped Sophia with her homework. They had dinner. Spaghetti, her favorite. They sat on the couch and read a book together. He tucked her into bed and kissed her forehead the way he did every night. Daddy, Sophia asked as he was leaving her room. Yes, baby. Is the lady the one who pushed me? Is she going to be okay? Marcus returned to the edge of her bed. He sat down carefully. I don't know, he said honestly, but I know she's going to learn something. Sometimes learning hurts, but it helps us become better. Do you forgive her? Marcus thought about Victoria standing in his garage, unable to find the words for an apology. That wouldn't fix anything. He thought about her face when she realized she'd humiliated the wrong person. He thought about the role his own choices had played in all of this. The choices to be quiet, to gather evidence, to plan carefully, to deliver justice in a way that couldn't be disputed. Not yet, he said finally, but maybe someday, after she understands what she did. The federal investigation took 4 months. By the time Victoria was arrested, she'd already been fired from every board position she held. Written articles she'd planned to write were cancelled by publishers. Social circles that had once welcomed her had closed their doors with quiet finality. The charges were specific: wire fraud, misappropriation of charitable funds, breach of fiduciary duty, personal enrichment through fraudulent means. Her lawyer advised her to take a plea deal. The evidence was overwhelming. A trial would be public, humiliating, ultimately pointless. Victoria agreed. She was sentenced to 3 years and 7 months in federal prison. The day she entered the penitentiary, she left behind a life that had crumbled almost completely. Richard's divorce papers had been served. Her children, both adult, now had made it clear they didn't want contact. Her house was being sold to pay restitution to the foundation. Her reputation was ash. In prison, Victoria worked in the food service line. It was minimum wage work, technically unpaid, but she could earn a small amount through commissary credit, and it required her to serve meals to other inmates. Mostly women, mostly poor women, mostly women who looked like the ones whose children had gone hungry because of her decisions. There was an irony in that. Though Victoria wasn't the type to appreciate irony, it took her 15 months before she really understood it. The moment came in the spring of her second year inside. A young woman came through the food line, probably 24 or 25, carrying a photograph. The photo showed two children, maybe 4 and 6 years old, eating from a bowl of soup. The woman, her name was Keisha, showed the photo to the other inmates and said quietly, "This is from 3 years ago, before the hot meal program got cut. This was the only hot food my kids got all day. Then it was gone, and I didn't know how to feed them." Keisha was in prison for forging checks to buy food for those children. Victoria was serving Keisha's meal when she realized something in her body go very still. Keisha had walked in the same world as Victoria's decisions. Keisha had suffered the consequences of Victoria's profit maximization. Keisha was here, imprisoned, separated from her children, because Victoria had decided that feeding children was inefficient. That night, Victoria sat in her cell and wrote a letter. It took her 2 weeks to write it. She started and stopped many times. She threw away draft after draft, because it was difficult to say what she needed to say. It was difficult to admit that she'd been wrong. Not just about facts and figures, but about people, about their value, about their right to be fed. The letter was addressed to Marcus Reynolds. The changes happened quickly once Marcus took control. Within 30 days, the hot meals program was running again, expanded to serve 5,000 children daily. Within 60 days, new staff had been hired. People who understood that numbers on a spreadsheet represented actual lives. Within 90 days, the foundation had been restructured to remove financial incentives for executives and redirect those savings directly to programs. By the end of the first year, the Eleanor Reynolds Foundation was serving more children with better meals through a larger network of community partners than it ever had under Victoria's leadership. Marcus hired a new CEO, an older woman named Dr. Patricia Hammond, who'd run similar foundations for 20 years and had been forced out by a hostile board that wanted cheaper leadership. She understood Eleanor's vision intuitively. She understood that the foundation was meant to be a tool of love, not a vehicle for ambition. Under Patricia's leadership, the foundation continued to grow. By the 5th year, it was operating in 12 states, employing 200 permanent staff members and serving over 50 million meals cumulatively since the restoration. But Marcus stayed in his garage. He worked part-time now, mentoring young mechanics from disadvantaged backgrounds, teaching them skills that could lead to independence and dignity. He still charged Mr. Thompson $50 for transmission work. He still treated every customer with respect, regardless of what they could afford to pay. And every night he came home to Sophia, checked her homework, made sure she had what she needed, and whispered thank yous to Eleanor for a legacy that was flourishing, because one man had been patient enough to plan carefully. Sophia grew up with the foundation's work woven into her understanding of the world. By the time she was 10, she was volunteering in the community kitchen, serving meals alongside people who'd once been served by Eleanor. By 13, she was teaching other children about the importance of providing for the vulnerable. By 17, she'd written her college essays entirely about her mother's legacy and her father's integrity. She was accepted into every college she applied to. She chose the one closest to home, not because she was scared of leaving, but because she wanted to stay close to the foundation's work. She wanted to understand it better. She wanted to someday run it herself. Marcus found out she'd made that choice while he was underneath the car, transmission fluid dripping from his hands. He had to set down his wrench and sit for a moment, because something very like pride moved through him, mixed with the kind of love so profound it made his chest ache. Eleanor would have seen this day, not as a ghost. Marcus didn't believe in ghosts, but as a kind of presence, a legacy living in their daughter's choices, their daughter's commitment, their daughter's understanding of what actually mattered. On a Tuesday in June, when Sophia was 18 years old and had just finished her first year of college, the Eleanor Reynolds Foundation held a dedication ceremony for its new headquarters. The building had been donated by an anonymous benefactor. Marcus, though nobody knew it publicly, Eleanor's name was carved in stone above the doorway. Inside, in a place of honor in the main lobby, hung Sophia's handmade card from that night at the gala. The card that had been crumpled and pushed to the floor by Victoria Sterling. The card was preserved now, carefully framed, with a small placard beneath it. Eleanor Reynolds Children's Foundation, founded on love, sustained by commitment, carried forward by the next generation. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was attended by board members, foundation staff, donors, and most importantly, by the children and families that the foundation served. People whose children had been fed by Eleanor's vision. People whose lives had been changed by Marcus's quiet restoration of purpose. Sophia stood at the ribbon cutting with her father beside her. She was wearing a simple dress, nothing fancy. But she carried herself with a kind of quiet dignity that was unmistakably Eleanor's and unmistakably Marcus's. When it was time for her to speak, she stepped forward without hesitation. My mother, Eleanor Reynolds, started this foundation because she believed something very simple, Sophia said, her voice carrying through the lobby. She believed that when you have more than enough, you share. That's the whole point. That's the whole story. That's what justice actually means. Not revenge, not humiliation of the people who do wrong. Just share, care, show up for the people who are struggling. She paused, looking out at the crowd. Her eyes found her father's. My father kept that promise when it would have been easier to let it die. He kept it quietly. He kept it patiently. He kept it even when the person running this foundation was trying to destroy it. He showed me that real power isn't about controlling people. It's about serving them. It's about refusing to measure people's worth by their bank accounts or their suits or their connections. It's about seeing them, really seeing them, and then acting accordingly. She turned to the ribbon and held it in both hands, waiting for the signal. My mama spent her last breath thinking about hungry children. I'm spending my life making sure she didn't die for nothing. This foundation, restored, renewed, recommitted to Eleanor's vision, is proof that one woman's love can last for decades. And one man's integrity can sustain that love when everything else falls away. She cut the ribbon, and the crowd applauded, but Marcus noticed that Sophia wasn't celebrating. She was standing quietly, eyes forward, as though speaking to her mother, as though Eleanor could hear her, and would be proud of what they'd built together. That night, driving home from the ceremony, Marcus looked over at his daughter in the passenger seat. She was staring out the window, lost in thought. You did good today, he said quietly. I'm scared, Sophia admitted. Being director of programs for the foundation, it's a big responsibility. It's what your mama would want, Marcus said, and you're ready for it. Not because you're perfect, but because you understand why the work matters, and because you're willing to do it right. Even when right is harder than easy. They drove home in comfortable silence. The old Ford F-150 with its dented tailgate and rust spots still running strong, still working hard, still honest. Years passed. Marcus retired from his garage at 62, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to spend more time just living, rather than working. He and Sophia would sit together sometimes, looking through old photographs. Eleanor at her wedding, Eleanor holding Sophia as a newborn, Eleanor at foundation events, looking radiant and purposeful, and certain of what mattered. By the time Sophia was 26, she'd become the official CEO of the Eleanor Reynolds Foundation. She ran it with the same quiet integrity that Marcus had modeled, not for profit, but for purpose. The foundation grew to operate in 23 states. It served over 211,000 children every single night. Marcus received Victoria Sterling's letter when Sophia was 24. It came forwarded from a lawyer. Prison mail had to be carefully routed, and it arrived at Marcus's house on a Tuesday morning. While he was having coffee on his porch, he read it once, then set it aside. He read it again that evening. After Sophia had gone to bed, Victoria had written carefully, honestly, without expecting forgiveness or even a response. She'd written about her time in prison. She'd written about serving food to women who'd experienced the consequences of her decisions. She'd written about finally understanding that people were not efficiency metrics, they were human beings, each one worthy of dignity. She'd closed with, "Your wife got her wish. I understand now what I didn't understand then. That real charity isn't about profit margins. It's about seeing people who are invisible. And I was invisible to that for most of my life. Eleanor Reynolds saw people, and because of that, people were fed. I don't expect forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that the consequences of my actions changed me. If that's the only good that comes from all the harm I did, it's not enough. But it's something." Marcus never responded to the letter. Victoria wouldn't have expected him to. But that night, after reading it for the third time, Marcus did something he did every night. He said a prayer for his family, and that night he added Victoria Sterling to his prayers, not because she was good, but because everyone deserved someone to believe they could change. On the 10th anniversary of Eleanor's death, Marcus took Sophia to the cemetery in Golden, Colorado, where Eleanor was buried. They brought a thermos of coffee and a small bouquet of daisies, Eleanor's favorite. They sat on the grass in front of the headstone for a long time without speaking. Finally, Sophia asked, "Daddy, do you think Mama knows about the foundation, about what we've built?" Marcus considered the question the way he always considered Sophia's questions, seriously, with full attention. "I don't know exactly what she knows, Em," he said. "I don't know how all that works. But I know this, your mama's last breath was a prayer for hungry children. Right now, tonight, because of what she built, 211,000 children are going to eat a hot dinner. Just tonight. Because of her." He paused, watching the mountains in the distance, watching the light change as the day moved toward evening. "Whatever part of her is still out there, wherever it is, I believe it's at peace. Because her work is still feeding people. And I think that's the only kind of afterlife that really matters." Sophia leaned her head against her father's shoulder. "I want to run it forever, Daddy. The foundation. After you're gone, I want to make sure it keeps going." "I know you do," Marcus said. "And you will. Because you understand what your mama understood. That love is the only currency that actually counts. You inherited that from her. And you'll teach it to the next generation. And they'll teach it to the next. That's how legacies work. That's how real change happens. Not through revenge or destruction, but through people who refuse to stop caring." They sat there as the sun went down, as the temperature dropped, as the day gave way to night, a father and daughter carrying the legacy of a woman who died too young, but left behind something that would outlast them all. When they finally drove home, still in the same old Ford F-150, still running strong, still honest, Marcus whispered something only Eleanor could hear, and if she could hear him, somewhere in whatever came after, she knew he'd kept his promise. She knew they all had. Years later, Long after Marcus had passed quietly in his sleep, at the age of 87, long after Sophia had become the most respected leader in the non-profit sector, the Eleanor Reynolds Foundation had become something bigger than anyone could have imagined. It didn't operate in the United States anymore. It had gone global. It served not just hungry children, but any child in need. But what was most remarkable wasn't the scale of the foundation's reach, it was the legacy it left in people's hearts. Because the real story wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about a poor man destroying a rich woman. It was about a man who had every right to be angry, every justification to seek revenge, and yet chose instead to restore something beautiful. It was about a woman who did wrong and faced real consequences, not because she was destroyed, but because consequences are how we learn to be better. And it was about a child who witnessed all of this and chose to carry her mother's legacy forward, not out of obligation, but out of love. Justice, the real kind, the patient kind, the kind that actually changes the world. That's not measured by how hard an enemy falls. It's measured by how many children get fed. It's measured by how many families get lifted up. It's measured by the lives that are changed. Because someone refused to let love die. Marcus Reynolds never became rich and famous. He died with oil stains under his fingernails, still wearing the suit he'd bought 11 years before. But he lived knowing that the woman he loved was still changing the world, that their daughter was carrying that work forward, and that every child who ate, because of Eleanor's vision, was proof that real victory isn't loud. Real victory is quiet. Real victory is a man and his daughter, a legacy lived daily, a promise kept across decades, and children fed, because someone decided that love mattered more than revenge.